So if we're talking about the fact that dissociative disorders relate to repeated trauma and extended periods of trauma, we spoke a little bit last week about your work that you did with war veterans. So were they a cohort of people who, I suppose, presented with potentially larger proportions of dissociative symptoms than the general public?
Yes, and I found that fascinating, learning more about dissociative symptoms with war veterans. And look, part of the story of me working with war veterans is, along with others who'd been very interested in dissociative disorders in the hospital where I worked, most of us left the hospital. It became very difficult to continue working there, partly because of the split that I described. And as I say, being moved from one team to another, it was feeling invalidated and feeling disenfranchised, which interestingly mimicked the phenomenon of dissociation itself. Like the hospital staff became split, reflecting a core aspect of dissociative experience that involves a kind of splitting or disconnection. But afterwards, I wanted to work with another trauma population, because I've become fascinated with dissociative experience, and so I thought that might be another group of people good to work with. So I moved to the Heidelberg Repatriation Hospital, and after about a year or so became involved with a number of other colleagues in helping setting up a program which we called the PTSD program, because we were highlighting that aspect of post-traumatic stress, which even then in the early to mid-90s, that was largely unrecognised as well. People commonly, when they were presented at team meetings, it wasn't highlighted their trauma experience, mainly their alcohol use and anger problems and depression and things like that. So even trauma was under-recognised in those days. But one of the things that greatly interested me is I was doing some research for my postgraduate studies when I was at the Repat Hospital, and I gave them the Dissociative Experiences Scale as one of the questionnaires I was using. And I was struck by their responses. The first time I gave it to them to fill out, they were actually in a group. And I thought that someone must have been answering in a certain kind of way, and others must have been copying their answers, because it was so unusual. Because how the Dissociative Experiences Scale works is you ask people about different experiences, like, do you sometimes find that you're looking at the world through a fog? Or how often do you feel as though your body doesn't belong to you? Or how frequently do you find yourself in a place with no idea how you got there? And you mark on a line where to the right means it's towards 100% of the time, and to the left it's 0% of the time. And I thought they must have been copying each other's answers, answering out to the right willy-nilly, because it was too hard to take what they said at face value. But after a while, it just twigged that half the war veterans had very prominent dissociative symptoms. And actually, these are some of their results that I had here. From 135 war veterans, very representative of the group, as about 90% of those that I'd come across were prepared to fill out the questionnaires. They said that they felt as though their body didn't belong to them about 17.5% of the time. Acting so differently as if they were two different people, 39% of the time. Looking at the world through a fog, 25% of the time. Not recognising themselves in a mirror, 9% of the time. Hearing voices that tell them to do things or comment on what they're doing, about 24% of the time, and finding themselves in a place with no idea how they got there, about 27% of the time. Now, I don't take those responses just at face value. However, I think they were saying that these things happened a lot. And when you think about trauma and complex trauma and repeated trauma and the impact it has on people, yeah, it's understandable that people would not be wanting to feel their distress in their bodies and minds. So having different ways of numbing or detaching themselves from that experience. So it kind of made sense that about half the veterans would have this prominent experience that added up to these averages. But it did really strike me how unusual that seemed compared to what I've been taught. We weren't taught to look for this. And then there was research coming out in the early 90s, including with war veterans, that showed similar results, that dissociation was very prevalent with war veterans, to the point that some people said that PTSD should be redefined as a dissociative disorder. Now, I think that was going a little too far, but I was doing some research on that at the time, on looking at the prominence of dissociation and the frequency of dissociative reactions in war veterans. And there's a whole lot of research that was coming out saying it was quite prominent. So that was kind of teaching us we should look for that in other clients as well, or when people have experienced significant past trauma, we should be looking for dissociative symptoms rather than ignoring them.